Welcome to Sport Buff Ahead of the Game, the place to hear from industry leaders in sports broadcasting and sports technology. I'm your host, Sarah Buck, and I'm thrilled to say that our guest for this episode is Andrew Ryan. Andrew is the managing director of FIBA Media, a joint venture between FIBA and DAZN, which comprises all rights commercialisation, broadcast OTT and data, production and distribution for FIBA's premium events. Andrew is also a member on the advisory board for LawInSport and occasionally features as a commentator on the European Cricket Series. Hi, Andrew. How are you?
Hey, Zara. Really nice to be on the podcast with you. Thanks for the invitation to chat today.
I'm really excited to delve into all about your career, actually, and find out about what it's like being MD of FIBA Media and a bit about kind of your love of the game and everything. So on that note, let's delve into your passion for sports a bit more. So I always kick off with some quick fire questions to these podcasts. So what's your favourite sports team?
Favorite sports team? Give tough ones to start with. I struggle to answer this with one team, but I'll give it a go. I grew up in a town called Redcliffe, just north of Brisbane, back in Australia. Very much a rugby league town, and that's certainly the biggest game in that part of Australia. In the winter, and my hometown team, the Redcliffe Dolphins, were probably my first love as a sports team. And they've been lucky enough to be the new franchise that's been included in the NRL competition for next season onwards. So it's going to be a big surprise seeing them go from almost local level competition to suddenly being in probably the biggest professional rugby league competition in the world. So that's something to really look forward to for next year.
Yeah, well, we'll get on to more exciting things as well next year, especially from the FIBA Premier Events calendar. I know there's the Men's Basketball World Cup, which
Absolutely.
must be quite a big thing to look on. And also before that is the women's. So it must be quite nice actually to have these really major, exciting events back in the calendar.
Yeah, completely. We had to navigate a fairly difficult road at FIBA for particularly the first year of COVID, and then pushing into 2021 as well, and ended up actually rescheduling three of the major continental events for this year. So we've had to push back the Asia Cup, the America Cup, and also Eurobasket, which is a very big event on the international basketball calendar. So they're all now happening this year in 2022. So usually 2022 is primarily around the Women's World Cup, which is being held in Sydney this year. But it's accompanied by some other pretty big events on the men's side as well.
Mm-hmm.
But absolutely, I mean, we're in a great part of the calendar now. It's probably the most international basketball is a great point, just being at probably the most intensely competitive state that it's been for a long time. And also just in this particular almost 18-month period, as you say, to have those three continental events, to have then the Women's World Cup in late September, and then the Men's World Cup next year is just absolutely huge. And sometimes I pinch myself that we are not only get to contribute to these events, but obviously then you get to set foot in them and be surrounded by some of the greatest athletes on the planet, both on the men's and women's side. So it's pretty cool stuff.
Sporting moments we've talked about, or athletes being incredible on the world stage. Just generally speaking, do you have like a greatest sporting moment that you always comes to mind that you would maybe relive in a second, whether you get it on your phone and relook at it, or in person from memory?
Yeah, there's lots that I sound almost a little bit patriotic. I think sometimes with these things, but I think if there was one singular moment that I guess particularly that I've experienced myself that I'd love to relive again, it was Kathy Freeman winning the 400 meters gold medal at the 2000 Sydney Olympics. And for those of you who are either less bigger fans of athletics or the Olympic Games itself, Kathy Freeman lit the torch for the Sydney Olympic Games. Was the most high-profile Indigenous athlete by quite some distance at that time, and really carried a huge amount of pressure into that event. And the Sydney Olympics was probably the first major event that myself and a few friends ended up sort of traveling to ourselves from Brisbane down to Sydney, stayed down there for a couple of weeks, and remarkably got five of the cheapest tickets that were available for that night of the athletics. And so I was sat 2 rows from the back of Stadium Australia on the just on the home stretch of that event. And there's probably 2 reasons I'd love to relive it. The first is that I don't think I've ever physically felt being lifted by a crowd, and that sometimes sounds ridiculous, but you've got 100,000 people in a stadium, and 99.9% of them were cheering for this result, I suspect. And as Freeman came round the bend to the home stretch, I've almost just never felt physically lifted out of my seat in the same way at any other event. And I think also just as a teenager at the time, I probably didn't fully appreciate what a massive thing it was for Australia as a country, particularly the Indigenous population back in Australia. And I don't think I wish I had been able to see that event fully comprehending just how much pressure there must have been on Cathy Freeman at the time and her ability to deliver in what were quite extraordinary circumstances, and just having not only the whole country get behind you, but almost the weight of history also sitting on your shoulders as well. So from multiple contexts, I'd love to have that experience again. And I'm also very grateful that when someone outside the stadium offered us, I think it was a couple of hundred Australian dollars for each of our tickets for that event, that despite being relatively poor teenagers, we decided to say no, and then got to probably experience the greatest sporting moment that any of us will ever see.
That's a great story. Yeah, well done for not giving up your ticket. So I want to go back to the very start, actually. So you joined FIBA Media in 2019, and previously, you led divisions at the IOC and Perform Group, but your background is in law. So yeah, tell me about the start of your career and kind of what led you to working more in sports media.
Yeah, it's an interesting role. I certainly didn't, as much as sport was by far my number one passion, and what I was probably told by my mum back in the day to ignore far more than I probably actually did. And, probably should have focused on schoolwork and a few other things more intensely. As it was, I went to university, did a double degree in law and psychology. Probably expected actually to take the sports psychology route more, but as it turned out, was going okay in my law studies. Ended up getting a job offer at a good firm in Brisbane, and that just felt like the sensible thing to do. Spent a couple of years there, eventually transferred to a new firm over in London, doing mergers and acquisitions type work, split time a little bit in New York and even a little tiny bit in LA. And it would, just a brilliant corporate experience, but I can't say that outside of the personal relationships that I developed there, that it was ever something that I felt, hugely interested in the way that you probably need to actually push forward in that career. And it wasn't until that I took a job as the in-house counsel for Absolute Radio, who had just rebranded from Virgin Radio at the time. And they were going through their own sale process for one of their major assets. So they needed an M&A experienced lawyer to come on board. And very, very conveniently for me, not long after they made their first bid for English Premier League football commentary rights, as in radio commentary rights. And so through that process, which we were ultimately successful in, I got to know a few people who worked in an industry that I knew existed, but had certainly never looked and thought that this was a realistic option for someone with my background. And the more I looked into it, the more I thought, actually, this is probably what I should push myself into. So I ended up doing a postgraduate course in sports law. Ultimately ended up interviewing for and got offered a job at Perform Sports Media, which I'd never heard of back at the time, but was an incredibly fortuitous bit of career development, because Perform, at the time was it had just listed on the London Stock Exchange, but it had also sort of started to take steps into almost every sort of modern digital sports market that existed. It was building websites for football clubs and other sports organisations. It had some tentative steps into the direct-to-consumer OTT market. It was the market leader in live betting video, live betting data. It had news access content, yada, yada, yada. And I think there were two things. I mean, basically, I got exposed to almost every rights holder on the planet through that organisation. there were also business models that we were developing that were essentially novel business models because they were tapping into areas that were outside of the traditional media rights and sponsorship sales for the sports world. So it was an incredible grounding over the 4.5 years there. And I guess the link to FIBA Media is that the FIBA Media joint venture that DAZN and Fibre entered into was one I was involved in back when it was set up. I think it was the end of 2015, and got to know a lot of the people who were involved in that. Obviously on the perform/DAZN side, but also on the FIBA side as well. So that was once again some fortuitous timing that I'd already had some connection to FIBA through that process.
You've obviously got a huge amount of experience working in sports media, and you've mentioned a few of the organisations that you've worked for. What have been some of the biggest changes in sports broadcasting coverage, on the events, all of the kind of areas that you oversee? What have been some of those changes you've seen over the years?
Uh, it's one of those industries that has both changed more than I think anyone could have expected, but also actually in some ways not changed that much. I mean, back when I first started, obviously, it was when the concept of streaming media was first starting to come into vogue. It was becoming more and more of a reliable platform. Probably the biggest change is that direct consumer approach has allowed other entrants to come into the media buying space, and whether that is the likes of DAZN doing it independently of any pre-existing, I guess, traditional media structure, or as we see now, more the likes of Peacock, Paramount Plus, and the like that are building on the top of pre-existing media enterprises, that it has changed that capacity for entrants to come into the market and essentially pursue and distribute rights, which back in the day it was obviously a much more narrow space in terms of who was in the market to acquire rights and the variety of ways that they could deliver them. I think whether that has necessarily worked out amazingly well for customers, and there's you can get a lot of commentary around the place from certain consumers who are not happy about having to subscribe to 4 or 5 different services, a combination of whether it's in the States cable and some digital services, or over here more likely satellite, or also terrestrial TV. That it's become it's probably a little bit of an overused word, but an incredibly fragmented space when it comes to the delivery of content. And I think that's strategically on the rights holder side is a consideration that is probably far more amplified now than it has been in the past. That it's one thing to go and look at who is the highest bidder or who's going to give you the best economic return for a sale of rights, but it's another thing to say essentially how many eyeballs are going to be on this content. Are my fans or other potential fans likely to be able to find it in amongst a variety of other entertainment options? And that understanding that I guess the scope of distribution options and where and how and for how much your consumers can access your content is just a far more complex world than it was 10 or 15 years ago.
We know content is key. It's a big part of the growth of FIBA media over the years, and consumer habits, fan habits, behaviors are changing. And I think COVID's highlighted that need for adapting and innovating in sports broadcasting. So how has FIBA Media adapted in light of sort of changing, evolving times?
I think certainly it's a good question. Certainly during COVID time, I think we discovered that we could do a lot more things remotely than we had in the past. We tried some new technologies in terms of literally the remote direction and production of certain games within the World Cup qualifiers. We were probably reducing our in-arena presence when it came to the production and operations side of things, and just the ability of people to communicate, not just communicate effectively when they're in different parts of the world or not on site necessarily, their capability to do that, but obviously all the tools that support that became better and better, and people just became more proficient at using them. I think the other part is, it was probably the two other parts. We had to go through our entire sales cycle process for the 2021 to 2025 cycle during COVID. So we essentially started that in March 2020, which was about the least optimal timing you could imagine for taking a property in the market, and particularly one that you were trying to build on the gains of what we call cycle one from the 4 years previous. But so that also required on the commercial side a lot of thinking around how it was that we could create buzz, how it was that we could particularly encourage new participants into those processes that had previously not necessarily been international basketball clients, and doing this without necessarily being able to go and see people in person, go and sit down for a dinner afterwards. And so we probably dedicated a lot more effort to the production of, I guess, bespoke media assets that we would filter through to potential clients, very much done on a nationally relevant basis as well, and things that might have just been nice to haves back in the day all of a sudden became real priorities to deliver. So that was certainly a challenge, and one that, full credit to the broadcast partnerships team within DAZN. We have some great people in there, headed up by Stu Walker, who really delivered some amazing results. And the guys over there, we've got Tom Davis, David Hart, Augustine Tan, Tane Lee, who and Robin Jellis on the intelligence side, just did a truly magnificent job in overcoming all of the hurdles that come from not being able to do their job the way that they would traditionally have done it. And being able to then step in to still keep those interactions going, still keep those clients interested. And sorry, I also left Amir Ozadem out of that list. So that was one thing. I think the second thing is just how much we re-strategized on the digital side. So FIBA's had an OTT service called Live Basketball for quite a period of time. I wouldn't say it was neglected, but it was something that happened in the background. It wasn't a major priority, I think, for quite a period of time. Not long after I turned up, the director of media and marketing services at FIBA, Frank Lenders, sort of posed a question to a few of us of how do we make FIBA fit for the future, and particularly considering what was on the horizon, both from the new sales process and what we were ultimately experiencing through COVID. And that led to a lot of internal strategy discussion, a lot of internal debate, a lot of discussion around what's the optimal approach for digital properties, and particularly, FIBA had a strategy for a long time of having the FIBA.basketball website that was essentially, the home of anything related to FIBA, everything from major events to, underage regional competitions. They had apps that were developed on a tournament by tournament basis. I think what we looked at and thought, okay, we actually think there's probably a space here for a couple of things. One is that basketball fans across the world are probably underserved when it comes to being able to follow multiple leagues or events from the same place. It was very much distinguished by league or distinguished by rights holder. So that was a space we thought we could step into. There probably also wasn't a great deal of crossover between any of the score type services and also someone providing video content, whether live or on demand. So we looked at if you were a basketball consumer, how is it that you'd want to try to access content? What's the sort of service that, keeping in mind, an ability to bring some live content to the table, how would we develop something that we would use on a regular basis? And we had Two Circles come in as a consultant for that originally, and ultimately as a partner in what became the Courtside 1891 venture, which was announced quite recently. And it's, in terms of what rights holders are doing now, especially I guess at the international federation stage, it feels like there's some elements that are consistent with a few others that have come out in recent times, but actually taking that approach of bringing in data from basically every league in the world, doing it in particular under a brand name that has absolutely no reference to the rights holder whatsoever. So we've essentially created both a new product and a new brand, and trying to do it in a way where, as much as FIBA is behind this and is probably the right organisation to push this sort of venture forward, at the same time, as a user, as a consumer, you really don't feel that whatsoever when you're using the product. So it's a really interesting thing to be at the start of the journey for, and I think it's probably something that in particular the next 2 or 3 years will be a source of not only a huge amount of work but a great amount of effort to really turn it into a success.
Is it creating that kind of personalization for fans then? Is that key?
Yeah, completely. And I think particularly given the breadth and the scope of both live data and video content that we're bringing into the service, that actually without that heavy personalization element, that it could be almost looked as just a bucket that almost becomes not unusable, but it becomes essentially a user having to put a lot of effort and trying to find what they want. So both in terms of explicit preferences provided by users and also learning implicitly what it is that they tend to gravitate towards every time that they use the product. That is all being pumped into essentially a big user data lake, and a lot of insights being drawn out of that to try to deliver a product that for every single person, whether so when you go and use it, Zara, you will have a very different experience to what I will use, on the assumption that we're not following the same teams and the same leagues, because the desire to try to obviously headline or prioritize the content that is most important to a user every time they come to us is both what we think is serving that user demand, but also providing a much more interesting and stickier experience that would otherwise be the case.
That kind of leads me on to some of the challenges then that sports leagues, broadcasters, rights holders, I guess, have in attracting the younger, the modern audience. Yeah, I guess if you want to talk to me, I guess, about those challenges that you've seen over the years and perhaps your approach to that.
It's probably arguably the biggest question in sports today. I mean, it was probably going back 10 years ago when you started to get through data around the aging audiences of particularly television broadcast viewers in the States. I always think you take those things with a bit of a grain of salt because they're just as reflective of who tends to watch broadcast television in the US as opposed to necessarily who are genuine fans of the sports, and which I suspect would trend certainly lower on certain properties like the NBA than they do through the data that comes through those processes. But I think that challenge of how do we ensure that next generation of sport, which is next generation of children, which is growing up now, actually come to love, appreciate, and are as passionate about not only following but also playing sport. And this is a generation that is growing up with far more entertainment options than certainly I did in my generation, probably even you did. And it's it's a long way from the days of you sitting down with your family to watch the Olympics or the Sunday night football and the like, that the capacity of children to make very directed decisions about what it is they do from time to time in their spare time is just unparalleled at any other point in history. And I guess the second part of that is also that it feels like we've moved into a space, certainly in Western countries anyway, where the default of going outside to play, whether organised or non-organised sport, is very, very much almost secondary to online or digital interactions, whether through social media or through interactive gaming. And that is they're challenges that I don't think professional or non-professional sport has had in a long time. Certainly not the sort of bountiful last sort of 30 or 40 years that we've had. And I think there's a lot of leagues and sports federations that are probably still parroting that, yes, we've got a great social media strategy, or we put out some great content on social, and that's enough. That's how we're attracting the kids, or we've got some great athletes, and of course the kids are going to be interested in that. And I suspect in the next 3 to 5 years, actually, the amount of specific advisors or the amount of work that should and has to go into how to really reach children at a more developing age to make them interested in sports and play as a concept, but also in particular some of the professional properties is going to actually probably spawn its own separate units or separate advisories, because you do have a chance here that actually you've got a generation that's growing up now with parents who, for the most part, were sports fans or were very in tune with the concept of sitting down and watching professional live sports. If you lose this generation here now, then that could pose some significant problems in terms of your addressable market for all sports when we go 15 or 20 years down the track, and it may change the face of sports viewership and sports fandom for a very, very long time. So it's pretty serious topic, and I think one that you've had a few of the American sports. I always look at the NFL, who in a way have almost everything going against them. It is a long, slow, complex sport that is played very minimally outside of the US. That is violent. It has plenty of reasons why parents shouldn't want their kids to get into it, and yet year after year they actually seem to increase their following. They seem to have or certainly do have some very, very successful, some would say than questionable approaches when it comes to getting kids into flag football, having more child-friendly broadcasts on child-friendly networks and the like. And for them to be able to do that despite every barrier that they theoretically should face as a modern day sport. Certainly, if you were developing a new sport, you'd do a lot of things complete opposite to what the NFL has as its attributes. I think there's a lot that other properties could learn from how they really, really focus on developing that younger demographic.
It's a massive topic. And FIBA Media are clearly innovative in kind of serving that next gen fan and playing around with different tools and solutions. So I'd love to reflect on the collaboration with FIBA Media, DAZN, and Sport Buff over the BCL broadcast on Twitch last year. So yeah, I'd love to know a bit more about your thoughts on that integration and how it benefited BCL fans.
Well, thanks for trumpeting the partnership as well, Zara. It's one of those things that it's always good to get feedback from your partners about how things have been successful on that front, and I think that was one of the most enjoyable and interesting, I guess, what they call a solution or approaches that we've taken in the last couple of years. It was a specific project for French broadcasts of the Basketball Champions League. So a couple of French teams that had qualified for the league that year. And it was also off the back of a partnership that FIBA had developed with Twitch to actually bring some more live and on-demand sport content to the platform, and doing very much so in a mutually beneficial effort to develop an audience and develop Twitch as a place where you could go and watch live sport. And obviously, when we do these things at FIBA Media or through FIBA, we try not to do them just in a way of let's put the content there and just hope for the best or make sure that the platform partner takes care of it, but actually try to do it in a way which is state of the art or market leading, or taking advantage of other things about the platform. And I guess that is very much where the Sport Buff team came into it, because of our desire to say, okay, if we're going to use Twitch as a distribution platform for this content, it would be insane not to take advantage of, in particular, the relatively unique elements of Twitch as a delivery platform. And I think through the quite strong background work we did, Sport Buff was by far away the leading service provider when it came to developing not just interactive components and delivering them in a way which is obviously very proficient because of their knowledge of the Twitch platform, but also developing them strategically so it was going to do the greatest job possible in terms of us elongating the amount of watch time that we had for this content, really doing so in a way which made viewers feel like it was a far more interesting, engaging, and interactive experience than they probably had with a lot of basketball content over the years previously. And I think it was an out and out success as far as we were concerned. And I think there's certainly a lot that we learned from that process, and making those broadcasts available, that I think strategically we're taking into the courtside 1891 venture as well. I think we're very determined to make sure that just doesn't feel like your run-of-the-mill OTT service, where it's essentially just a one-to-many distribution of video content, and there's really nothing else happening on there. So I think the product that we've got in the market at the moment for courtside 1891 is essentially our I wouldn't call it the beta product, but it's the first steps of making sure that we have the live stream delivery, making sure we've got all the stats and scores available for leagues around the world. The next step will be actually developing some of the components that actually take the OTT live delivery to the next step of whether that is interactivity, whether that is delivery of sort of more brand relevant promotions within the stream, whether or not that is directing people to take advantage of other interactive opportunities, whether elsewhere or separately on our platform, and both that live stream aspect and the interactivity around the game center, I think, is, as I said, both not only our probably next important step, but also one of the most important steps we'll take with that product.
What is that impact having on fans? That interactivity, immersivity, gamifying, that impact on sports content, do you think? You've touched on it a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's. Look, I'll say for starters, I don't think it's necessarily for everyone. I mean, you look at some industry publications and there's a relatively non-nuanced view that essentially if we don't turn everything into a video game, then the next generation or even the current generation is essentially not going to be interested whatsoever. I think the absurdity of trying to reconcile that view with the fact that you have a generation that has grown up watching Netflix content that is completely non-interactive and is essentially delivered to them as a lean back experience. So I think you've got that one point. This doesn't have to necessarily satisfy everyone, but at the same time, there are a group of people, and probably ever growing group of people at different age groups that actually love the opportunity to whether you call it interacting with the content, but I think to be entertained and have the opportunities to I guess take part in experiences around particularly live content, and whether interacting with individuals, whether interacting with a platform, that just actually make it a more wholesome experience for them. It's sort of the same if you sit at a basketball game and you sit and watch the basketball and nothing else, then that's an experience. It's a pretty entertaining one. But you go to a top level game, whether it's a FIBA one, whether it's an NBA game, and there's entertainment in and around the breaks, and there are opportunities around the arena to take place in whether or not it's basketball related games or anything of that ilk. And it's layering that experience to turn it into something that delivers far more value to the fan than if you were literally just providing a singular linear experience. So I think it's an industry that I think we've almost just only tiptoed in to a certain extent to date. I think there's a lot of, whether you call it trial and error, certainly a lot of trial going on at the moment as to what works well, what is very much strategically additive to the experience that you're delivering rather than detracting from it. And it's been interesting to see, particularly through the NBA League Pass service, the way that they've added components at certain stages, whether it's quiz or voting options to games, then taken them off for a period of time, and then tried some other elements that require viewers to interact. And I think there's a lot of learning that will happen in this sort of 2 to 3 year period that will then, in the coming years, actually move us towards what is a certainly not standard, but certainly a really, really well informed discussion and implementation of what of these interactive elements actually work really, really well in a live sports broadcast.
Could talk to you forever about all these engagement opportunities and exciting stuff in the years and what will come and what you'll be keeping a close eye on. I want to kind of move just quickly. Just want to talk to you about that really exciting initiative that you launched, She Calls Game by FIBA Media. It's all about having female voices, amplifying female voices and commentary over basketball. So yeah, great initiative. Just love to know a little bit more about what led you to that.
Probably a couple of things. First and foremost, it's one of the things that I think the rest of the team are proudest of what we've achieved within FIBA Media over the last couple of years, an adventure that was very much supported by FIBA management wholeheartedly across multiple departments. The She Calls game came from two things really. One was a view that our commentary was just frankly too male, probably in a way too English sounding to an extent, and that actually we didn't think that reflected the modern day basketball fan. We didn't think that reflected the people who were listening or watching us, and we also didn't think it was quite a reasonable representation of the variety of voices that should exist in the sports media world. So there was that one part of just we wanted to change up the sound of our content for the world feed. The second one was, I guess, filtering on through that when we did actually try that, when we tried to proactively find commentators and particularly female commentators for events, not just in Europe, but in the rest of the world. It was much harder than anticipated. I think we were almost finding that you had a small number that had filtered up to, for instance, commentate NBA games or G League games, and that were, either exclusively contracted to certain broadcasters or were just not sort of in the range of what we were looking at. And finding anything below that actually was very, very difficult. So She Calls Game was one, something strategically, something that we thought was a great initiative to bring more female voices and to promote the concept of female voices within sports media. But it was also serving a very practical need that actually through that process, not only did we crown ultimately a winner who is girl Julia Montesano from Melbourne, who'll join our commentary team for the Women's World Cup in 2022. But we also got in contact with a number of very, very experienced and highly credentialed commentators that we simply weren't aware of previously. So it wasn't just a case of saying, let's do something, a big and shiny competition where we're bringing in lots of entries from people across the world and saying, isn't this wonderful, this initiative from FIBA and FIBA Media? But it was actually very realistically something that has given us an entire new stable of female commentators that we can draw on across all parts of the world, depending on where our events are. And frankly, I think our coverage is just all the better for it. And I think even now, I think it was last year, we had a female commentator, and in many cases, multiple female commentators at basically every single major event or qualifiers window that we had. So it's not just something that we're looking to do and saying, okay, let's have a female voice for women's basketball. Actually, we want female voices to be across the whole gamut of international basketball, and there should be no reason why that just does not become the absolute standard and the expectation, rather than something that needs to be trumpeted or seen as a modern day approach.
Okay, to wrap, as MD of FIBA Media, what do you do to stay ahead of the game?
Probably listening to podcasts is a great way. I think it's great that sport buffs in this space now. There's plenty of good ones around the place that get into those deeper discussions. I guess more so. I think as a sports media industry, we're sometimes, particularly in the news side of the industry, a little bit press release driven, a little bit let's not scratch below the surface too much. I think whenever people ask me this question, particularly younger people or students, I always say you can read press industry materials to a certain extent in the sports media world, but actually you've got to develop that almost a little bit of a cynical bone in your body to really, really get beneath what it is that someone's doing or seeing. Are they just doing it for a little sparkly headline, but there's probably no great strategic driver below it. So, and some of that only comes with experience. So I think podcasts are absolutely a great way. Some of the more long form reads that you get from time to time in places like The Athletic, which actually go into the sports business world pretty well, are quite helpful. I love getting the leaders bulletin each week, because once again, those guys, James and Dave in particular, take almost that slightly cynical viewpoint to certain things. It's not just a rehashing of headlines, but there's always that need to sort of really critically analyze what's being fed to you. And I think the greatest example of that at the moment is in relation to whether or not it's cryptocurrency, fan tokens, Web3, NFTs, and the like. I mean, you read or you listen to some publications, and it's essentially NFTs could do everything for you, including going for a toilet break at the arena in between quarters. It's sort of gotten to the point of completely absurdist hype. On the other hand, I think there's probably been a lack of analysis and lack of publications that look in and go, okay, fundamentally, what is happening here? What does an NFT do? What does a smart contract achieve or potentially achieve that cannot be done at the moment? What are some of the more practical uses for this, rather than just the stuff that's created a lot of hyperbole over the last 12 months? Because I think it's a space that there are some actually really, really useful activations of that sort of technology. I think the stuff that's come out to date is probably, once again, really just scratching the surface. But on the flip side, certainly a danger in that space of leading everyone down this incredibly golden path at one stage, and then getting to the end of it and actually having a lot of folks saying, actually, we don't really understand this. Actually, the value's not there. You had the instance with I think the Formula One game that Animoca was supporting, for a couple of years, that people had purchased NFTs or been granted NFTs through that. Suddenly that became useless when that relationship stopped, and trying to get these things to the point where people understand both the benefits and the limitations of them, can make sensible decisions off the back of that, have realistic ambitions with what can and can't be achieved. That, to me, feels the next step in that space. But that is a really hard space to get to, given the level of hype that sits around a lot of that activity at the moment. So I'm sure it'll continue to dominate conversation for a while yet, but just hopefully it will be a somewhat more educated conversation in the coming couple of years.
Thanks again to Andrew Ryan for that fantastic chat, and we've got more episodes on their way with sports industry leaders.